Let's begin with an overview of the events of that morning in order to start us off on the same page, looking at the jets and the impacts and how this myth developed.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
So when it was attacked again, he immediately...
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust.
We ran through the window of the building, it went into the...
Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
We need to look for these kinds of people and these kinds of events that are the first ones interviewed by mainstream media, planting the official story in the minds of people.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, let's take a look at that. What we do is we apply the scientific method which many of us learned in 7th and 8th grade. It's the best way yet discovered for winnowing truth from lies and delusion. The simple version looks something like this. We formulate a question. How did the Twin Towers collapse? We perform research. We make observations. We construct a hypothesis. We have an idea how it collapsed. It collapsed by fire. It collapsed by explosive controlled demolition. We make some predictions. And we test those predictions and those assumptions with experiments, objective, verifiable, repeatable experiments. We analyze the results and we draw conclusions. Now, if those conclusions are found to be corroborated by the evidence, we report it in an open, transparent manner where our experiments and our findings can be repeated. If it is not found to be corroborated, we think and try again and construct a new hypothesis with new observations, new research. Buildings are destroyed by a number of different forces, each of which have very different and identifiable characteristics. For instance, fires affect buildings quite differently than controlled demolitions. Fires, by their nature, tend to creep from place to place as they run out of fuel, moving to fresh new fuel sources, leaving the burned out area to cool. So when collapses do occur, and by the way, you'll note that they've never occurred in over 100 examples of very hot, very large, and very long-lasting fires, buildings tend to fall over. They fall asymmetrically. They're burned out on one side organically, if you will. It's a natural process. They don't fall straight down through the path of greatest resistance. Let's listen to Jonathan Barnett from FEMA talk about what fires are expected to do in steel buildings.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
So what was the cause of the devastating, explosive failure that happened to the World Trade Center?
These particular buildings collapsed. They follow the path of least resistance, or they fell over. You can see that the building structure holds the building together in some recognizable form. The structural elements have not been dismembered from each other, and the concrete is not pulverized to dust. They follow the path of least resistance, which is generally over. These buildings exploded. Witnesses hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. There's thick, billowing, and enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete. The expansion of the gases very quickly produces this cauliflower-like formation that we see in the smoke. This is a controlled demolition. Let's focus on this type of destruction first. We have hundreds of examples from all across the country from which to make our comparison because it's the most commonly used method to demolish high-rises. This is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives. Controlled demolitions can be engineered in many different ways. Normally, the purpose of a controlled demolition is to remove a structure while avoiding damage to adjacent structures, and to do so economically. Typically, a tall building like this is demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and then detonating them in a very precise order, starting with the interior structures and then progressing outward, synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the interior columns allows the unsupported weight to pull the exterior inward. Destroying the building from the ground up allows the weight of the building to be harnessed to do much of the destruction. So the result is an implosion, producing a vertical, symmetrical collapse at free fall speed into a consolidated rubble pile that's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Now, this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can accomplish.